In the second part of Chapter 11, we're going to spend most of our time just talking about some growth and trends in sponsorship spending, both domestically in the United States, but also globally. And so we talk about the mega sporting events of the world, the Olympic Games. Let's start with that. We've talked about the top program. We'll talk more about it in the Olympics chapter. But before the 1984 Games, which were held in Los Angeles, there were only a few sponsors associated with the international sport, specifically the Olympics. Because what happened in 1984 is every time there was an Olympic game hosted, there is an organization that is called the OCOG. It's a part of the Olympic family. Again, we'll talk about it more in the Olympics chapter. But the OCOG is the organizing committee for the Olympic Games. And essentially, the Los Angeles had an OCOG. Every city that hosted games has a OCOG specific to that games. And the 1984 OCOG in Los Angeles gave sponsors things that really changed the face of sponsorship for international sport. First, it gave the media exposure. In 1984 was right after the advent, or soon after the advent of satellite television. And this really helped the broadcast of the sport globally. A lot of the developed countries in the world were watching the Olympic Games using satellite technology. It had a positive brand image that was built with around the opportunities of the Olympic Games. Started to show that there was commercialization was acceptable in sport. Part of the reason is the American culture of sport at the time was basically that imperialistic, non-forced, in this circumstance, action, and that the Americanization of sport, the commercialization of sport globally has really helped with that. One also very important thing, and this is a thing to note, is that it started to reduce clutter. And the reason we say this is we started to see exclusivity in market categories. Exclusivity in sponsorship means that if a sponsor comes to an event promoter and says, I want to be the exclusive fast food company of the Olympic Games, or I want to be the exclusive bank, or I want to be the exclusive cell phone provider. Coca-Cola, for example, is the exclusive soft drink and beverage company for the Olympic Games. No other beverage company can be a sponsor, official sponsor of the Olympic Games. Pepsi can run ads on other channels that aren't a part of the Olympic Games to try to associate with the games. That's where ambush marketing comes in. We mentioned that in the last chapter, or actually 2 chapters ago. But exclusivity reduces clutter. There are only 30 sponsors that were allowed in the 1984 Games. And that was the first time we started to see a reduction in a cap. So it gave more value to the sponsorship because of that. And also, they approached it as a business relationship. They saw that there was an exchange of goods in this circumstance and that there was a mutual benefit that both parties could achieve. The Olympic Games, the IOC, needs revenue to be able to distribute to the Olympic family. That is all of the organizations that we'll talk about later. But the game's success was contingent upon financial investment. And really, the 1984 Games was the first games where you started to see a profit because of commercialization. So, what has influenced the growth of sports sponsorship spending? Well, one of them is legal restrictions of tobacco and alcohol have changed the promotional spending for a lot of companies to sport. In a lot of respects back, at least in the United States, you started to see in the 70s and 80s a big push towards the use of tobacco products, and in some countries you have alcohol restrictions and how they can advertise. Again, goes back to the culture, which is oftentimes founded in the religion of that culture. But we started to see changes in legal restrictions for tobacco and alcohol in the United States, how they can be advertised in sport as well. We also saw that firms started to discover that they could achieve new levels of exposure through sport, that it gave them an advantage over their competition to be in front of sports fans who have discretionary spending that are passionate about their sports teams. We also saw that sponsorships also became more cost-effective than other avenues. I could spend $1,000 on a billboard, or I could spend $1,000 on a sport organization, and they started to see a higher rate of return on that $1,000 by going to sport organizations. Sport consumers also are becoming more accepting of the commercialized nature of sport, and this is across the globe. Part of it is the influence that America's had on this. And then finally, sponsorship gives firms the ability to target specific audiences through media exposure, things that they would otherwise not be able to gain the attention of a consumer in their target market, and send specific messages to them. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So here's some other things. As I go into these figures, just know that I'm not going to ask you specific questions about stats. So how much is spent, for example, in total global sponsorship spending. I'm never going to ask you, is it 62.8 billion or 62.9? I won't do that. But the point is for you to understand that there are trends. This is global sports sponsorship spending that was projected in 2017. The newer stats aren't up yet, so I can't help you most up to date. But you can see here the trends from 2013 through 2017 have all been about 4 to 4.5% growth globally. That's 62.8 billion with a B US dollars spent on global sponsorships. And what's really unique about this is so many people think, well, I want to work in the sport industry, and they don't look at the sponsorship side. How much money is being spent? Let's just take in sales as an example. That's $62.8 billion that a salesperson is getting a commission on. No, a series of thousands and thousands of salespeople. But the point is, there's a lot of money on the sponsorship side of spending, and then on the corporate side of activation, which we'll get to in just a little bit. Global sponsorship spending in 2017 by region. You can see across the globe, Europe has 16.7 billion, Asia Pacific 15.7 billion, 4.5 in Central and South America, and that is going to continue to increase. And then all other countries contribute to $2.7 billion. We'll talk about some North American statistics here. This was 2015, so it's a little bit off of what I've been telling you the last couple of slides. But you can see that the growth rate across the world is generally anywhere from 3% to a little over 5%. Europe had a 3% increase in 2015. North America had a 4% increase, and they're at 21.4 billion. So you can see that they are the largest sponsorship spending in North America. But you can see largest increases in Central and South America as well as Asia Pacific. When we talk about this idea of BRIC, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, are where a lot of the spending across industries, arguably where we're going, is also being seen in sports sponsorship. Looking at the growth of advertising versus marketing versus sponsorship, because again, advertising is just one promotional element, and the marketing dollar of these corporations are being spent in different ways. But how are these being spent in sport? You can see that marketing and promotion has had a substantial increase in 2014, but in 2017, sponsorship has 4.5% increase, advertising 4.4%, and a 3-point increase, percentage increase in 2017 across the marketing and promotions aspect in sports, and that's globally. So who are the top sponsors? I just wanted to show you some top sponsors in the U.S. You can see the top sponsor in the United States. I believe these are 2016 or 15 stats. But either way, it's a good indication of the point I'm trying to get across. PepsiCo spent the most, is $360 million on sponsorship spending in the United States. $305 million. Anheuser-Busch, and you can see it goes down. Coca-Cola, Nike, General Motors, AT&T, Toyota, Ford, Adidas, Verizon, Miller Coors, and FedEx. One thing I want you to notice across all of these companies is the one thing they all have in common. They are all companies that produce products for the average everyday consumer. Meaning none of these are traditional. I mean, there are some B2B relationships, but most of them are business to consumer relationships. They're selling a product to the average citizen. And so all of these are telling you one thing. Who watches sports? Okay, well, the average everyday consumer. So these advertisers are trying to put, or these companies are trying to put their marketing dollar in front of sports consumers through sponsorship. And so you don't typically see B2B companies, businesses selling to other businesses in sponsorship because it wouldn't help them out. They want to have direct contact with these other businesses. And so sponsorship spending is typically on those consumer-based products. And the last thing I want to show you is projected shares of North American sponsorship market, because when we talk about sponsorship spending, it includes more than just sports. Okay. Now, a majority of it is sports. It's estimated in 2017 that there was 70% of sponsorship in North America being spent on sports. That includes everything from Little League all the way up to the professional leagues. Entertainment pulled in another 10% of that. So these would be any type of movies or television shows, those types of things. Causes, so sponsorship of the Fundraisers for different causes would be 9%. The arts, 4%. Festivals, fairs, annual events, so music events could be a combination of entertainment or festivals. And then 3% of that went to associations and or membership organizations.